right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our discussion group for the Greenville Chautauqua. This is our 25th season of Greenville Chautauqua here in Greenville and the surrounding area. I will mention that when we first started doing Chautauqua here, we didn't have like library discussion shows. But there was another Chautauqua in another part of the country that said that the librarians put on book discussions because George Frine, our founder, George Frine, he said he did a show for this Chautauqua in another state. And at the end of it, the question and answer period was fabulous. And he went, wow, because it was like out in a rural area and they were all farmers. And he said, what did the farmers know all about all this stuff? And he was so impressed. And the librarian and the people who ran that Chautauqua said, well, during the months leading up to it, the librarian puts out books and says, you know, if you're going to be ready for the Chautauqua this summer, you guys need to read these books so you'll know all about it. And George said, what a great idea. And thus we started doing this, it's been a long time. We've been here with the library, 14, 15 years, maybe more. And thus we have nice crowds like this that come in and learn all this information in advance of actually having a chance to see the character featured here. I was thinking about tonight, because tonight, of course, we are going to be learning more about life in the period of time that in which lived an American patriot by the name of James, simply known as James at the time. And I thought, as a spy, as a patriot, when I was growing up, even as a little boy in school, I only learned about really one American spy. And we all learned the story of this one American spy, and we learned his last words that he spoke before they hanged him. And you remember, you know who I'm talking about? Nathan Hale. We've all heard the story of Nathan Hale. And I thought, wait a minute, though, when you think about Nathan Hale, he was a lousy spy. I mean, I hate to be disrespectful because the guy had great last words, but the truth is he was a really lousy spy. He only did one spying mission. Okay? And he was supposed to spy where the British were and then report back, but instead he was afraid he was going to forget where the British were, so he put it on a piece of paper, which of course, when you get caught, it sort of says, oh, look at me, I'm a spy. And then, of course, he thought, well, what if they caught me? I'll hide it where they'll never look. I'll put it in my boot, which was the first place they looked when they were looking for papers. So Nathan Hale, that I heard about all these stories about Nathan Hale, he was not really very good at it. But what he was very good at was getting hanged. Because, you know what did he say? No, it wasn't give me liberty or give me death. So that would fit. That would fit. No, he said, I only regret that I have but one life to give for my country. I mean, it sort of gives you a little patriotic chill, right? And that's why we remember Nathan Hale. But he was our great example of a spy? No. And so maybe we'll find out a little bit about the culture and everything going on in the 1700s and what we had a successful spy, why maybe we haven't heard all that much about him. Because here's a guy, well, I won't get into the story, you'll hear it all. And of course, you'll hear even more when the spy himself is here this summer to tell you all the secrets of his career as a spy. But tonight, we have an expert on this period of time to set the frame for our summer festival. Our speaker is Carmen Harris, Dr. Carmen Harris, a professor of history who teaches African American and U.S. history, Southern and Latin American history. Her research teaching interests include African American, Southern, and South Carolina history. She served a 6-year term as a member of the board of directors of the South Carolina Humanities Council, one of the organizations that helped to sponsor us so that we can have the shows that we have here, and has served as on the membership committee and the Minority Committee of the Southern Historical Association. So our speaker is going to know her history. Dr. Harris has published several articles in books, the chapters of books on various subjects related to African Americans in the agricultural extension programs. So our speaker tonight, ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Dr. Carmen Harris.
Thank you for that introduction, Larry. I was going to come down and walk around, but I understand that I need to be up here to be seen. Am I being seen on television right now? Am I being seen? Okay. I just want to be sure. I'm going to go ahead and open this water just in case I need it. So, as Larry said, my name is Carmen Harris. I'm in my 26th year of teaching at the University of South Carolina Upstate. I'm a native of Gaffney, South Carolina. I've actually done one of these before. Years ago, I did one on Denmark Vesey. So I kind of remembered standing on the platform and wasn't really looking forward to that, even though as a person of short stature, it gives me an opportunity to lord over people. So that's something that's very nice and unique. I wouldn't say I'm an early colonial expert. I've had coursework in that. I've taught that. But I also teach on a regular basis 2 courses in African American history, one of them which begins in 1619, an interesting date that I plan to work into this conversation. And it goes to the Civil War, and I do teach a second half one as well. So I've taken about 20 graduate courses, which is more than a lot of people because I got my master's at Clemson, which has a terminal degree, and when I went to get my doctorate, they said, Clemson master's, so I essentially took as much coursework as someone who started there with a bachelor's degree to get the PhD. So I can teach a lot of different stuff, and I know stuff about a lot of different things. So tonight, I am going to be talking to you not so much about James Armstead Lafayette himself, because I feel like if I do that and looking at what I could find on him online, there's not going to be a lot to do for your interpreter, but to act out what I'm saying. So I thought it would be more appropriate tonight to talk to you about this particular world and this particular moment from the perspective of what it was like to be an African American in this period. Am I still being heard? I'm supposed to hold this close to my mouth too. I'm trying to manage all of my tech here. So I put up here, what shall we call them, patriots or servants? African Americans and the American Revolution. And I put this up for a reason, because like much of early American history, the place of African Americans in that narrative is one that's kind of ambiguous. What position do we occupy? What is our position to the relationship to the narrative of this country? And so that's really the kind of foundational question that I'm taking my remarks from tonight to help you understand that, you know, being an African American and being American is a challenge. W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this. If you've ever read Du Bois' Soul of Black Folk, where he says one ever feels their two-ness, a Negro and American, 2 different identities warring in one dark body. And I think that's kind of a theme that we can look at the entire history of African Americans in this country from 1619, and yes, we will get to that. And also, you know, even before that, most people don't know that African Americans were in this country before people from the Mayflower, that the first Black people in South Carolina were here in 1525 at Georgetown. And so it's a different kind of narrative when you look at history on a different timeline rather than a Mayflower and Jamestown centered timeline. But tonight I'm going to be talking about the American Revolution. And the first point I want to make is that when we look at the history, especially of the British colonies, but you could look at the history of the Spanish colonies as well, this is not the first time that men of African descent had fought to protect the lives of the white people who enslaved them. If you go back to the Spanish exploration, which I have up here, Estavianco, He actually helped save some of those Spanish explorers because he learned how to speak the indigenous languages when they did not. His presence as a Black person, something that many of the indigenous people saw as kind of mystical, was something that also made a good part of that journey very safe. When we look at the history of this country, we know that from almost day one, most people of African descent in this country were enslaved. They did not come here voluntarily. They weren't immigrants like the Texas textbook tried to say. You know, they didn't get on the boats. One of my colleagues actually has a picture from a Virginia textbook from 1957 where they had these kind of English-style dressed Africans standing on the deck of the boat shaking hands with the white guy who's getting ready to bring them across the Atlantic. So we have these kind of mythologies out there. Most African they didn't like enslavement. They resisted sometimes with violence. Perhaps you've heard of the Stono Rebellion in 1739, which really freaked out a lot of South Carolinians. But they'd also fought for white South Carolinians, for example, earlier in the Yamasee War. And what happened at these moments is that, you know, when it was a choice between life, death, and arming Black people to help you fight off some hostile Indians, the choice for many Southerners at that time, or people wherever they was quite easy. Let's arm our slaves because the belief was that they loved them and they wouldn't hurt them. But we also have Fort Mose. Fort Mose was one of the reasons that the Stono Rebellion happened. King Charles of Spain had issued an edict, a cedula, and it said if you are enslaved by the British and you make it to St. Augustine, which is where Fort Mose was, you will be free. They didn't free their own Spanish slaves, but if you were a British slave and you got there, you would be free and you would do military type service. If you look at the laws of this time, in pretty much every colony, there were statutes that prevented or prohibited African Americans from having offensive weapons, and that included things like sticks. There were laws that prohibited them from striking white people. But despite these laws, as I said, when push came to shove, you can see it here, Jacques Lefebvre's attack on Charlestown during Queen Anne's War, the Yamasee War, the Cherokee Wars in the 1760s, which is about 20 years after Stono. They were willing to give these enslaved people weapons. So this is not just in South Carolina, but this is all over. But at the same time, they passed laws like this law from Virginia in 1680 that says if any Negro or other slave carry or arm himself with any club, staff, gun, sword, or any other weapon of defense or offense, nor go and depart from his master's ground without a certificate, without a pass from his master, mistress, or overseer, such permission not being granted, but upon particular and necessary occasions, every Negro or slave so offending, not having a certificate aforesaid, shall be sent to the next constable, who is hereby enjoined and required to give the said Negro 20 lashes on the bare back laid on well. That was the solution to anything. Anytime they felt like behavior modification was needed by African Americans, they did lashes laid on well. So what happens here, when we get closer to the American Revolution, things change. And I have this quotation from Thomas Jefferson. It's a few decades later. It's during the Missouri Compromise, but I think it kind of encapsulates what was going through white people's minds in all of this time. So Jefferson is writing about the Missouri Compromise. But as it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale. And what would be just would be to make Missouri a free state, to stop the expansion of slavery. But self-preservation is in the other. And that choice between doing what is just and self-preservation is something that we can read backwards into the historical behavior before the American Revolution, during the American Revolution, and after the American Revolution, how white Americans chose to deal with African Americans. So we're going to look at what's happening in the early American Revolution. I want to take you back to 1775, 1776. This is the period of the Stamp Act crisis. This is when the famous Gadsden flag, "Don't Tread on Me," gets created. Henry Lawrence writes about this because what's happening is that you have all of these sons of liberty complaining about, how their rights are being taken by the British. We're being taxed without our consent. This is unjust. This is unfair. And they're saying this in front of people who are enslaved, who by law have been denied literacy, but being denied literacy does not make one deaf. And so these enslaved people are hearing these kind of objections. And sometimes even the people who are objecting say words like, "We are not going to be enslaved by the British. We're not going to give up our rights as Englishmen." So, if I can hear and I'm an enslaved person, I'm going to be thinking slavery must be bad because these guys don't want to be enslaved. And so what Lawrence does is he gives us this account, a peculiar incident revealing in what dread the citizens lived among the black savages with whom they were surrounding themselves, was furnished in January by some Negroes who apparently, in mere thoughtless imitation, they couldn't imagine that these people had the intellectual, the cognitive capacity to understand liberty. They began to cry liberty. He could not understand that. And that actually happened in the Stono Rebellion, where these saltwater Africans, recently arrived Africans, one of the things they took on their battlefield as they tried to go to Florida was a flag that had the word liberty on it. So they understood, even though they were not free, what liberty was. Just like even though I have never won the Powerball, I understand what I would do if I won the Powerball. You don't have to experience it to be able to imagine it, to be able to plan what you would do if you had that opportunity. And I think, when I'm teaching my students even, that's something that, it's hard for them to grasp that slavery of the body and slavery of the mind are two different things, that you can be physically incarcerated, but you can be mentally free. So I put Stevie Wonder up here. If you know Songs in the Key of Life, song Black Man. That line is from Black Man, first man to die for the flag we now hold high was a black man. So this came out decades ago. And that on the left is supposed to be an image of Crispus Attucks. And I guess down here in the right, this kind of, to your left, the kind of, he's not the one that's laying down that has a dark brown face. He's actually the one that's kind of being held up. He's kind of light-skinned. He was mixed race, probably indigenous and African. He was referred to by some as a saucy boy. And he was joining in with other white Bostonians in taunting these British soldiers, cussing at them, throwing snowballs at them that had rocks inside. And somebody, supposed to sing fire or something like that. And he ends up getting shot. And he is feted, he is celebrated, eulogized, taken to his grave, not as a second-class citizen to these men, but all of them were recognized as martyrs, something that would have been very unusual for that time. But that's something that points out the fact that from the start of this revolution, African-American people understood what the stakes were, and they were invested in these stakes themselves, the stakes of liberty. So the other thing I want to point out is also African-American men, especially in northern states, And slavery was still in existence until about the start of the American Revolution. Vermont was the first state to outlaw slavery in 1777. The other ones did so between the early 1780s and the early 1800s. A lot of times that was done for them by lawsuits. For example, Elizabeth Freeman. But even with that, there were these drilling days, and so you had African Americans who were part of the militia. You'll notice here that I have lit up parts of this quotation here from the Black Minutemen who were at Lexington and Concord. Unlike in the South, even enslaved African Americans in the North were not denied literacy. A lot of Puritans up there, people who believe that the only way to get to heaven, you got to read the Bible for yourself. So enslaved people in the North were not denied literacy as it was in the South. So what do they say here? Resolved that it is the opinion of this committee of Black Minutemen as the contest now between Great Britain and the colonies respects the liberties and the privileges of the colonies, which colonies are determined to maintain, that the admission of any persons as soldiers into the army now raising, but only such as are freemen, will be inconsistent with the principles that are to be supported and reflect dishonor on the colony, and that no slaves be admitted into this army upon any consideration whatever. So when this war started, what white people wanted, the message they were sending is, this is a white people thing. Y'all slaves don't have anything to do with this. But what these Black Minutemen were saying is, if you are fighting for liberty, if you believe freedom is right, you are wrong for excluding us. You are making a mockery, you are making a hypocrisy out of your own cause by these policies. And we'll see this kind of debate go back and forth. One of the things that's important to understand is that you have African Americans involved in all of these affairs. So here's Peter Salem at the Battle of Bunker Hill, one of the early battles. We've never heard his name either. And when I was actually looking at this picture, if you look at that little red arrow over there, when I was putting this PowerPoint together, I was like, hey, that's a Black guy. I don't know who he is, but there are at least two people of African descent, men of African descent, and maybe a third one next to the guy who looks like George Washington at Bunker Hill. So that freedom that people talk about, Crispus Attucks might have been the first man to die, but you had other African-American men who actually also began to fight for the independence of the colonies from Great Britain. The Continental Congress, I pull these things out of the Continental Congress because this is where I see irony, ultimate irony, not paradox. I see irony in this. And these are some of the comments that were made in the Continental Congress by people like Jefferson and Franklin, all of those, the Rutledges from South Carolina, the Pinckneys. We will, in defiance of every hazard, with unabating firmness and perseverance, employ for the preservation of our liberties, being with our one mind resolved to die free men, rather than live as slaves. Hands, we have counted the cost of this contest and being perfectly convinced that it is infinitely find nothing so dreadful, and resolved hearts we will in our computation as infamy and voluntary slavery united, honor, justice, and humanity, forbid us tamely to surrender that freedom which we received from our gallant ancestors and which our innocent posterity has a right to receive. One point I want to make is that no African volunteered to be enslaved, regardless of what that 1957 Virginia textbook said. There weren't people lining up at the point of the door of no return saying, let me row out to that boat and get on that boat and not see my family again. So, the kind of distinctions they make are just very interesting to me. Notwithstanding the zeal we had manifested for the service of our sovereign and the warmest attachment to the Constitution of Britain and the people of England, a Black and horrid design, and that's why some people want to be called African American rather than Black, because bad things now apparently are Black, to convert us from freemen into slaves, from subjects into vassals, and from friends into enemies. So they see that slavery is not, these are people who believe in natural law. Y'all know what natural law is? So it's this kind of concept that we are all born with certain kinds of rights given to us by God. Life, liberty, and property is what John Locke said. Thomas Jefferson plagiarized that and said life, liberty, and then did a word switch, I guess, so he wouldn't get caught by the professor and changed property to pursuit of happiness. He's lucky I wasn't his professor because I would have dinged him on that. But anyway, but you see here, they, repeatedly during the revolution, these men who subsequently go on to perpetuate slavery for another nearly 90 years, they got a problem with people making them slaves. So that's really where a lot of this interesting paradoxes come in. Edward Rutledge of South Carolina made a motion to discharge all Negroes in the Army, and he was strongly supported by many Southern delegates. South Carolina was majority Black. Peter Wood, in his book, Black Majority, says, has this statement, more like a Negro country. From 1708 really down to the end of the American Revolution, when African Americans leave South Carolina in droves with the British, the state was majority Black until, they start importing enslaved people. So by 1820, it becomes majority Black again after not being majority Black for almost 40 years because of those people who went off on the Book of Negroes or whatever. But the reason that they don't want that is because they remember Stono. There were about 60 white people killed at Stono. And they don't like the idea of Black people with guns, or Robert Williams, who was a civil rights fighter who fought with weapons, Negroes with guns. I think it's the name of Tim Tyson's book about him. So what happens is they have this thing called a Council of War that's going to run the war. So in October, that council is going to consider whether it would be advisable to re-enlist any Negroes in the new army, or whether there will be a distinction between such as are slaves and those who are free. So they agreed to reject all slaves and reject the great majority of free Negroes at the same time. So even those African Americans who were not handicapped by being enslaved, who were citizens of their state, who might be required to muster out for state militia, and we're really talking about the northern states, New England primarily, were denied the right to fight. So then there's another question. So it keeps coming up. In October, again, ought not Negroes to be excluded from the new enlistment, especially such as slaves? All were thought to be improper by the Council of Officers, agreed they shall be rejected altogether. So they go through that twice. And then they get to December. George Washington writes to John Hancock, "It has been presented to me that the free Negroes who have served in the Army are very much dissatisfied at being discarded, as it is to be understood," that's what he means by apprehended, "that they may seek to employ in the ministerial army. That if we don't take them, they're going to fight for the British, because they're going to fight for somebody because they want in on this battle. I have presumed to depart from the resolution respecting them and have given license for their being enlisted. If this is disapproved of by Congress, I will put a stop to it." He wasn't a fan of it. Everybody knows George Washington owned slaves, but some people don't want you to think about the fact that he owned slaves. He did. In fact, one of his slaves, Ona Judge, who escaped him when he was president, escaped into New England. He pursued her throughout the rest of his life, and then left notes from the grave to find her if he could. He never did. There's a book about her called Never Caught. But what was he reacting to? He's reacting to this thing, a proclamation by Lord Dunmore in Virginia, 1775. He's the last British governor of Virginia. And I was going to flip over here to see that I have some of this enlarged here. So in that proclamation, he says, "To that end, that the peace and good order may be sooner restored in Virginia, I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard or be looked upon as traitors to His Majesty's crown and government, and thereby become liable to the penalties the law inflicts upon such offenses, such as forfeiture of life, confiscation of lands, yada, yada, yada. And I do hereby further declare that all indentured servants who are white, so there are still indentured servants at this time, Negroes or others appertaining to rebels, free that are able to bear arms. So if you owe a labor obligation to someone and that person is a patriot, and you're an indentured servant or an enslaved person, you can quit your master and get immediate freedom if you say, yeah, I'll come, give me a gun, I'll fight my master. They are joining His Majesty's troops as soon as it may be for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. So this is what changes George Washington's mind, because this is about November, I believe, and if you look back here, this proclamation, I think December is when Washington says, well, if they want to change their mind, I'm good with it. But this Dunmore's proclamation came out, I want to say November 7th, maybe. The exact date isn't right, but for some reason I want to recite that. There were multiple reasons for the reversal. We celebrate the American Revolution as a celebration of patriots who gave their last measures of devotion, their lives and sacred fortunes for this country. But that's not really the way it happened. You had militias who wouldn't leave their own colony to fight. You know, they would fight to the edge of their colony, and the Continentals who were obligated to fight, countrywide, if we want to call it a country, would have to keep going, and they would just stand there because that's not, not everybody was fighting for the same thing. So you needed to have people to serve. And a lot of whites, were getting tired, saying, I've done my duty, I'm not going back. There's nothing you can do to kind of persuade me that I need to really re-sign for this because, it doesn't really bother me. The British hand really isn't that heavy on me. I mean, the people who felt the British pressure most were those in the leadership class because they had someone above them that could always overrun them. But the people below them still had somebody above them who could overrun them. It would just be the people who were already, taking over in the Continental Congress and things like that. So really, some historians say about 40% of the Americans were patriots, about 40% really was like, meh, and then about 20% were actually loyalists. So, when we think of this as kind of this great upheaval, this swelling of American patriotism, it's not necessarily so. The alternative for many of these people also, for these African Americans of serving in loyalist ranks, was something that many of these folks saw as intolerable. That they could not allow those numbers to swell the numbers of the British enemy, especially because, unlike the British, they were from here and they knew a lot about what was here. And so that's something that's very important, being from the place. Most people don't really understand, when you look at the Vietnam War, some people say Ho Chi Minh actually used Washington's strategy of not winning. It's just like not losing because they could melt away. So the Declaration of Independence, when they wrote that, when they drafted that, they thought about putting something in about Dunmore's proclamation. What's excised on the left is what they thought about putting. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty, in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. And he put men in capital letters. I didn't do that. I'm just copying what he did. Where men, so he recognizes the humanity. He uses the same word that he uses earlier in the Declaration. All men are created equal. He doesn't say black men or anything. He says men. kind of suggesting that there is one human race. Men should be bought and sold. He has prostituted his veto for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might not want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them. So he's recognizing that enslaved people are born naturally in liberty and murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with the crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. So it's liberty versus life, and life comes before liberty. So enslaved people can't be free. So South Carolina and Georgia didn't like this. And if you've ever seen Ben Franklin with Paul Giamatti, if you've ever seen 1776, Tobacco, Rums, and Slaves, where they talk about this, South Carolina was pretty, the politicians were like, we're good. We don't have to be in your revolution. We could just go back to what we're doing, because Dunmore was willing to let people who were loyal keep their slaves. That wasn't something to say all slaves in Virginia was free. It's just patriot slaves were free. So that didn't go over, because what those people at what those men at the Continental Congress wanted more than anything else was unity, or at least the presentation of unity. They wanted everybody to think we're a united front, we're going for independence. And that's how we learn this, right? We don't learn about all the people who were meh, and we don't learn about all the people who were loyalists. So all that survives is he has excited domestic insurrections among us. And you'll see this in the Constitution as well. A domestic insurrection is a slave uprising. Okay, he talks about the Indian savages differently, brought them on us, but domestic insurrections are disturbances in our house. So these are some selected facts that I pulled off battlefield.org to talk about African-American military participation. When we're talking about spies, we're not talking about men who were armed, but I think it's important to understand the full panoply of action that African-American men took. They served from the first battle of the American Revolution to the last battle of the Revolution. The Continental Army and most state militias were actually racially integrated. Black Americans' motivations for enlisting were similar to those of other enlistees. One of the things that the Continental Congress did, they said, you fight, you get a land bounty at the end. You fight, you get freedom. So there are all these different motivations on both sides. What can I get from putting my body in front of a bullet at this moment? Black Continental soldiers received equal pay, something that they didn't get in the start of the Civil War, and mostly equal treatment. There were about 5,000 Patriot soldiers and 4 times as many Loyalist soldiers, and that is because most Black people lived in the South. That's where slavery remained ensconced after the American Revolution, and most of those people still had kind of, feelings and skepticism about giving those people weapons that they might not train at the enemy, but might train at them. There were more Black soldiers fighting in the North than in the South for that reason. And some people who fought as soldiers were actually enslaved while they were fighting. They did not get their freedom until afterwards, and then sometimes not even then. So this is how they might have looked. This is a Dunmore. So this is a Loyalist over here, the Ethiopian Regiment of Dunmore. He's wearing his little outfit there, and it says liberty to slaves emblazoned on it. Not that other enslaved people can read it, so I don't know who's it for to read it, but it says liberty to slaves. So he's trying to make this moment a moment about, people who are clamoring for liberty, but at the same time enslaving at that time about 1/5 of the population, about 20% of the population. On your right, you see what a patriot soldier might have looked like. So they're dressed very similarly to the ones that you see white soldiers wearing, unless you're like an over mountain boy or something. That outfit over there kind of reminds me of some of the mountain men clothing that people wore as irregulars as well. So these are some of the outfits you see there. This picture is often commonly reproduced in a lot of different early U.S. history textbooks. Both my African American history textbook and my U.S. history textbook to 1877 have this picture, and you can see both of them in there. The one with the green hat, I don't know if you've ever been to Cowpens, but at Cowpens they have a guy that kind of looks like that. So he's kind of like an over mountain man, more irregularly dressed. This is actually a flag for the African American militia from Massachusetts, the Bucks of America. And I don't know how I feel about that name, because sometimes buck is used as a very pejorative name for African American men who are enslaved, but it's also a very powerful animal. I mean, you don't want to get headbutted by one of them, I'm sure, but it kind of has a flag motif. I can't see what the writing is because a lot of that came off, and I should have read the caption to see what that is, but I was more interested in the flag. This picture is a picture from the Battle of Cowpens. And guess what I found out? So I'm faculty chair at Upstate. So I think a week ago Tuesday, or maybe 2 weeks ago Tuesday, I went to the State House to, try to lobby the legislatures to tell them higher ed needs more money. We need your support, so please tell your legislators that, because we need more money. But this picture, the original of this picture, is actually hanging in the as you go up the stairs to the chambers in the Capitol. Picture, and I was like, wow. I was very surprised by that. So you can see this African American, as I said, they're at every battle of Cowpens. He's probably a Northerner. One of my colleagues, Dwayne Pruitt, wrote a pamphlet for Cowpens called Things Hidden. And it had about 50, I think he identified maybe 15 Black men who were at the Battle of Cowpens. They were at the Battle of Kings Mountain. There's at least 3 known. This is a good picture of that rock, but it was on the internet, and the only thing I can find, but it names 3 known African-American men who were at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And they may have been part of those who rushed overland marching from Cowpens to get to Kings Mountain in one of the penultimate battles of the war. This is Francis Marion and his band of irregulars, the Swamp Fox, engaged in guerrilla war. And you can see in this picture not only an African American clearly here, the guy behind the guy in the green coat might also be African American, but I think the one with the turban on is Native American. So it was a mixed race band, and rather than fighting as regular army, they just kind of hit and ran. And so you see African Americans doing all of these different kinds of phases of the war, taking an active role in winning the independence of the United States. I think I just pushed a button I didn't mean to push. So now we're going to get to the role that you're going to be hearing about this summer, James Armstead Lafayette, an enslaved man from Virginia who was secured, who was an American spy. And I would say there's one reason that spies who were African American were probably successful. And that reason probably is because white people are racist. Those white people, now I'm not talking about y'all, those white people. And what I mean by that is they would likely have not thought that an enslaved person would be smart enough, wouldn't have the cognitive capacity to do the kinds of things that Nathan Hale was supposed to do. We know he probably didn't write something down and stick it in his boot, or if he did, nobody looked in his boot because they probably thought slaves can't write. So this is a picture of what he supposedly looked like. He wasn't the only African-American spy, and African-American spies, I dare say, were quite much more successful than white spies. I couldn't find a complete list, but I went through battlefield.org, and these are some of the things I found. So James Armstead Lafayette was enslaved to William Armstead, his new last name. And this is something African Americans often wanted to be Washington's because of George Washington's history in the country. He was a double agent. So he would go to the British and act like a runaway slave. And because you had so many thousands of African Americans who were running away from their masters, when Dunmore's boats were moored in the Chesapeake Bay, people were trying to get on those boats because they just wanted to get out of Virginia. They didn't want to be there anymore. So it was plausible that he was a runaway slave. And so when he went to General Cornwallis's camp, he was welcome. He gave them information. They thought it was a quid pro quo. They thought he was giving them factual information that would help them win because the other enslaved people who were coming to them wanted their freedom and they wanted to be helpful to the British. And so their own kind of misunderstanding of what might be going on at that moment was actually something that was their undoing. He was assigned to work under Benedict Arnold. I don't know why the B is small in his name, but he's a traitor, so I guess that's okay. It wasn't intentional. I just noticed it. So what he does, he warns Washington that reinforcements are on their way to Yorktown to reinforce Cornwallis. And that enables Washington to block these reinforcements. And that's how the American Revolution is going to end. There were other spies for the Patriots. Quaco Hunnian, he was enslaved by a loyalist, so he didn't want to remain enslaved to his master. A lot of times loyalists left the colonies at the end of the revolution and tried to take their enslaved people with them, which, if I was an enslaved person, I guess I would go with them, because if I stayed here, what happened in places like South Carolina is a lot of the slaves of loyalists were actually confiscated and then given to people who fought in the revolution, like a land bounty. It was a person bounty, so they were given that. So he facilitated the capture of a British general in Newport, Rhode Island. There was one in South Carolina named Antigua, I guess that's how they pronounced it, who spied successfully for South Carolina. And this image here, I don't need to read it, but it's just an image of the law where they not only emancipated him, but they emancipated his wife and his daughter, and they gave him some money as well for being such a good spy. So even in South Carolina, where they don't want you to be armed, and I think that's a good thing about spying, you don't have to carry a gun for that. So you're not really super dangerous if you're just kind of like gathering information. And these are general orders from Yorktown in October of 1781. It having been represented that many Negroes and mulattoes, the property of citizens of these states, have concealed themselves on board the ships in the harbor, that some still continue to attach themselves to British officers, and that others have attempted to impose themselves or impersonate upon the officers of the French and American armies as freemen, and to make their escapes in all manners. So this is a thing, and it's something that happens again when in the Civil War, where you have a vacuum. So you look at slavery. In times of peace, there is kind of a surveillance culture, right? Everybody who's white is kind of deputized into watching out for anybody who's black, because anybody who's black, the natural understanding of blackness is black and slave are interchangeable words. So they're seeing that. And so what they're trying to do here, in order to prevent their succeeding in such practices, all officers of the Allied Army and other persons of every denomination concerned are directed not to allow any such Negro or mulatto to be kept in their service, but on the contrary, to cause them to be delivered to the guards, which will be established for the reception at one of the redoubts in York and another in Gloucester. Mr. David Ross will have the superintendency and will give passes to enable them to return to their masters, or where that is not practicable, will have the directions to make other provision for them. Any Negroes or mulattoes who are free upon proving the same will be left to their own disposal. So what they're saying here, now that this war is over, we need to get this slavery thing back going. We need to get that culture kind of regimented here. And, talking about this, so as soon as Yorktown was over, if you were an enslaved person trying to get out, if you didn't get out, you were going to go back into slavery. In 1783, we see in Virginia, it says here, it has been represented to the present General Assembly that during the course of the war, many persons in the state had caused their slaves to enlist in certain regiments or corps raised within the same, having tendered such slaves to the officers appointed to recruit forces in the state as substitutes for free persons whose lot or duty it was to serve in such regiments or corps, at the same time representing to such recruiting officers that the slaves so enlisted by their direction or concurrence were freemen, and it appearing further to this assembly that on expiration of the term of enlistment, some such slaves that the former owners have attempted to force them to return to a state of servitude, contrary to the principles of justice and to their own solemn promise, they freed them. 1783. They said if you sent a slave to be a substitute and said that person was free, because in Virginia you had to be free to enlist, you can't take that back now and re-enslave them. So that's what that says here. I wasn't waiting for the next thing. So there, it says here, let's see. It appears just and reasonable that all persons enlisted as aforesaid who have faithfully served agreeable to the terms of their enlistment and thereby, of course, contributed toward the establishment of American liberty. So they're acknowledging that Black people contributed toward the establishment of American liberty and independence should enjoy the blessings of freedom as a reward for their toils and labors. Be it therefore enacted that each and every slave who by the appointment and direction of his owner hath enlisted in any regiment or corps raised within the state, either on continental or state establishment, and have been received as a substitute for any free person. I'm not going to read all that because it's longer than it looked when I pasted it, so I'm going to not read it, but you get the idea. They're going to be free. Including this guy Aberdeen, who they named down here, a Negro man slave who has labored a number of years in public service and lead mines, and for his meritorious services is entitled to freedom. So they do make these kind of special exceptions to the idea that Blackness and slavery are the same. The interesting thing you'll find out about James Armstead Lafayette is that despite his meritorious service, and Yorktown was in 1781, he was still enslaved. His master did not free him at that time, maybe because he was playing a runaway slave. The Marquis de Lafayette himself actually sent this note to say, this is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligences, his information from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and faithfully delivered. He perfectly acquitted himself with some important commissions I gave him and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. So he's saying, why isn't this guy free? He didn't have the information in his boot. He didn't get hung and said famous last words. He actually got it done. You see? So it took that to kind of shame them into getting this done. I'm going to look for a second. I'm going to look for something. I think I actually left somebody out. I don't see him, so I'm going to talk about him for a second before I go on. I'm trying to go back, and it's not working. Can you go back? I'm pushing the up arrow. It's not letting me go. Should I be pointing at that? So there was another guy named Saul Matthews who was also at Yorktown. And both Saul Matthews and James Armstead Lafayette had to push for their freedom. I must have saved this without the Saul Matthews slide in it. Saul Matthews actually also, go back one more, please. I just want to be sure it's not there. Saul Matthews also had to write a petition to say, hey, I provided this service. I should be free. And so it took something, even though these folks had given as much as any white soldier, they still did not get the freedom. Sometimes they didn't get the bounties, they didn't get the land or anything like that that they had been promised. So it was given on a racial basis. So Saul Matthews isn't there, so I'm just gonna skip that. I thought he was in there, but I think I must have not saved it. Now it's going the right way. So what happens after this? You've had African American men not only prove they can spy under pressure and be successful, but they can also fight under pressure and be successful. But the Southern state-dominated government, and it's Southern-dominated because the 3/5 compromise means that even though there's the same number of white people in New Hampshire and South Carolina, that South Carolina gets 2 more congressmen because they get to count 60% of their slaves. This Southern-dominated legislature doesn't want that cognitive dissonance of having free Black men who, have aspirations and want to rise in the nation. So they get the Militia Act of 1792. And this is a law that says that if you're going to be in a militia and thereby be in the military, because the U.S. military is actually made up of calling up the militia, of nationalizing them, you have to be an able-bodied white male citizen. And that's the statute, and it stays the statute for 70 years until we get to the Civil War. And again, why does it change? It changes for the same reason they decided to arm Black men in the American Revolution. We need some extra bodies to shoot bullets and take bullets. So it's the same kind of thing that happens there. So what is the legacy of this? And I put this, I take it forward to the Civil War, because I think, and people, African Americans of that period, from the American Revolution down to the Civil War, they were aware of the sacrifices their forefathers made to make this country. And they were also aware that, the country had been unjust to them by not giving them that freedom that they fought for. And they remember that legacy. So what does Frederick Douglass say? Let us endeavor to hope for the future and improve the present auspicious moment for creating anew our claims upon the justice and honor of the Republic. And above all, let not the honor and glory achieved by our fathers be blasted or sullied by a desire of the true heroism of the lack of true heroism of their sons. The question, why do we know Nathan Hale? And why do we not know James Armstead, Lafayette? Let the Black man get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, Frederick Douglass said, and none could deny him the right of citizenship of the United States. Well, we know because Jim Crow happened and the civil rights movement happened after that, neither one of those laws came to the conclusion that you would expect. That, we always thank our military men for their service. We say our military men deserve the best place, and, doing a Sojourner Truth thing when she points out what they say women get and she doesn't get that. Aren't these men patriots? What shall we call them? Are they patriots or are they servants? What does their sacrifice mean? Charlotte Fortin talks about them. Regiments of freedmen could demonstrate to the nation that true manhood has no limitations of color. But that had been something that had been part of how the country had been laid down from the start. So that's why I put some questions up here. Why do we celebrate Nathan Hale or George Washington, who lost more battles than he won, actually, and the one that he's most famous for winning was won for him by 2 Black men who provided intelligence, James Armstead Lafayette and Saul Matthews. We know George Washington, but we know neither one of these men who helped him corner Cornwallis on that peninsula. The other thing we have to think about in this is how rights have historically been distributed in this country, the difference between natural rights and earned rights. And typically, white men get the natural rights. You're born, you got the right anatomy, you got the right color, boom, you're as my husband says, Bob's your uncle. It's not hard for you. But for people of color, for white women, we have to prove we're good enough to deserve those rights. If you look at white women got the vote after struggling in World War I, supporting the war, to say, oh, you supported the war. You can have the right to vote. And you're supposed to say thank you for something that's supposed to be natural. So that's the question. Why did Armstead Lafayette have to repeatedly petition for his freedom? And then why did his enslaver get money when they set him free? And Saul Matthews was not set free until 1792, which is 9 years after that war. And I think, you know, when 1619 came out, and by the way, watch the Hulu event on that. I watched that. It was very informative. I don't think I have the slide up here, but they have a professor from South Carolina. His name is Woody something. I can't remember his last name, but he wrote a book called Forced Founders to talk about African-American experience in the American Revolution. And a lot of the historians who are coming down on Hannah Jones, I come down on her for not being a historian, doing history type things, because I need that job. But other than that, there was a lot of validity. You can find nuggets of truth in what she was saying. And I tried to plug some of those in here tonight. But if you say, oh, 1619 isn't the founding of this country, we can't look at the arrival of slaves as the founding of this country because that's denying the real heritage of our country. Well, guess what? In 1776, Black people fought for the freedom of this country. So you can't get away from Black people if you go to 1776 rather than 1619. And so I just kind of put some of these things up here. Books, Benjamin Quarles' book, he's dead, he's been long dead, but one of the earliest African-American historians who wrote about this. Edward Countryman wrote about this. I can't read that guy's name. So it's American Patriots and the American Revolution. Gary Nash's book is one that I've used. Forgotten Fifth, Death or Liberty by Douglas Edgerton, African Americans and Revolutionary America, Black Patriots and Loyalists Fighting for Emancipation in the War for Independence by Allen Gilbert. So there's a lot of things out there. There is a lot in this narrative about African Americans. And so when you meet this character, I hope that you ask him about that world, because it's a paradoxical world, as Edmund Morgan said in American Slavery, American Freedom, where you have people who are fighting for liberty at the same time. If you look at that Continental Congress, a whole bunch of those dudes own a lot of people who labor for their happiness. And I guess I'll stop. Is that enough? I hope it's enough. And I'll take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris. And now, of course, is that interactive part of our program where we get a chance to ask questions from the audience. So if anything occurred to you during the presentation, I'm sure it did, this is your chance to raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone over to you, and you can ask questions that our historian in residence tonight should be able to help you with.
Do you know if James had an education?
I do not. Probably not.
Use your microphone, please.
I'm sorry. The question was, do I know if James had an education? I do not. I would say probably not, because Virginia's slave laws were as draconian as South Carolina, which meant that literacy was denied to African Americans. That was a crime to learn how to read. And so in all likelihood, not. Unless he kind of bootlegged literacy somehow.
We have a question from the live stream audience. Where can I get more information about the South Carolina spy Antigua?
I don't know, because I found him online and I looked him up, and the only thing I've been able to find so far is that piece that I cited from the South Carolina General Assembly, the Acts and Resolutions. I don't know that anybody's written about it. Maybe I should. I don't know who he belongs to. And I haven't seen anything about him in any literature. If you want to read about the concern about Black spying, there's a book by William Harris, no relation, and I can't think of the exact name of the book, but it's about a man named Thomas Jeremiah. He was a very rich Black guy in Charleston. He had a hotel, and so the white guys said that he was trying to foment a rebellion. They put him on trial. The colonial governor tried to save him. The South Carolinians weren't having it. They convicted him, they hung him, and then they took all of his wealth. But I think the book is called The Hanging of Thomas Jeremiah. There might be a couple, but I've never heard of Antigua until I was doing this research. Right here in the front.
Hello.
Hi.
Throughout the entire long length of the Revolutionary War, did the British ever know that he was working for us, Lafayette?
That's an interesting question. I would suspect that when he didn't leave with them, that might have been a clue. I honestly don't know. I looked up as much as I could find out about him, but he did not leave with them. And so that should be indicative of the fact that he was not on their side, because one of the things the British did in many different ports, including South Carolina, Georgia, Savannah, Charleston, and even in some of the New England ports, middle colony ports like New York, is they said to African Americans, if you want to come with us and you want to be free, you can get on the boat. If you've ever heard of the Book of Negroes, some of them ended up in Canada and Nova Scotia. Some of them eventually went to Africa, and some of them were put enslaved. So that would be a good question to ask the reenactor, because I am not an expert on Lafayette.
I'd like to go back to the beginning when Black people were brought to this country. Were all of the Black people who were brought to this country as slaves free people before they came, or were they also, were any of them slaves either in Africa or Europe?
Some of them could have been enslaved in Africa, but this is I want to make two differences because I don't want kind of moral equivalency here. One of the things is that slavery in Africa was different, in that you weren't enslaved based on your race, because everybody was Black. Slavery was not necessarily something that was for life. You could be enslaved for debt. You could be enslaved as a war captive. And it wasn't intergenerational, which meant that when a woman who was enslaved gave birth to a child, that status did not pass to that child. Those are things that are uniquely European, and how they created slavery in this hemisphere to enable them to perpetuate slavery intergenerationally. So when you see slavery in Africa, it's something that you've probably done something wrong that got you into that, like you were on the losing side of the war, or you owed somebody some money or something. But that's not the case here. You could have done nothing but just been in the wrong place at the wrong time and find yourself enslaved.
Did the Europeans have slaves in Europe, or did they only?
There were sometimes, it didn't last as long and wasn't as deep there. It was more deep in the Mediterranean. So if you go to the Mediterranean countries and you look at Renaissance paintings, you'll see Black people in there. Apparently having a Black person in your painting, kind of said, I'm rich because I got a Black person in my painting. So that was kind of a status symbol to have someone who was enslaved. The roots, you did have people who were enslaved in other places, but as I said, it didn't last as long, and it never really took root as deeply as it did in the Western Hemisphere, where you had agriculture, and that's how enslaved labor was used.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
okay, the Islamic world had slaves.
Hold the microphone closer.
The Islamic world had slaves. And to a large part, they were probably the beginning because they go back way before what America, when America.
Okay, well, we got to go back to ancient Egypt because in the Bible it says the Jews were slaves. So if you want to go way, way back, let's go all that way back.
Okay, I'm going to say, I'm Greek.
Okay.
Turks, and the Greeks, we were second-class citizens for 400 years. There was slavery, and it was intergenerational. And that was brought forward after in the 1400s.
Were you ever in, okay. So two things. First of all, the word slave comes from Slav because Slavic peoples were enslaved in the Roman Empire. And I don't like to get into like contests about whose slavery was worse, but this is one of the, I'm going to say what Thomas Jefferson said about slavery. When he referred to to that area of the world, he said all you had to do was to free them because they're all white. So when you look around this room, who in this room had slave ancestors? Me and Larry, but Larry don't know. You don't know Larry because he doesn't look like he has African ancestry. I found out he's 1% black, so he's a brother. But anyway, so you don't, but if your ancestors were enslaved, if somebody was gonna have to put money on which one of us had enslaved ancestors, and it was a lot of money, they'd probably pick me. Okay, and I think that's important to understand is that slavery exists in all times and all places, but I'm not here to discuss slavery in all times and all places, including in China and in Africa and every place else. I think this is our particular issue and our particular problem because the founders of this country decided to create a system of race-based slavery. They started with Native Americans, but by the time you get to the 1700s, unless those Native Americans are mixed race, part black, they're being moved out. And they make that a status for people who have African ancestors. And that's something that and they develop this whole of why that's okay. If you read Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, he talks about how orangutans come after black women like black men go after white women. He talks about the texture of the hair. So, pretty much Thomas Jefferson says the black people are enslaved, first of all, because they're ugly. And second of all, he says they're enslaved because they're cognitively defective. He has no respect for Phyllis Wheatley's poetry. He has no respect for the writings of this guy called Ignacio Sancho. He says that black people are good at music. So before people started saying we could do music and sports, he was already saying we could do music and sports. So that's something that was, that's something that's not really new. And so I just think that something happened to me, I would say probably with the George Floyd thing. I hope I'm not running people out, but something happened with George Floyd where I just at the point where I just say we cannot soften the history of this country by whataboutism. We have to really understand that, this has had profound effects on this country, on my family. I can't trace my ancestors but before 1825, and that's the only reason I can get back that far is because two of my enslaved grandmothers were still alive in 1870. So there are consequences to the choices that our leaders made. How do we deal with that? I deal with that. I'm appreciative because I believe that where we are, I have a PhD. I have a white husband, that hottie back there in the corner with the beard. I'm where I am because of people of goodwill who struggle to make those principles that these guys talked about but weren't willing to live up to a reality. So that's the one side of it that I would like to say, but I think on the other side, I just don't really do well when people try to, let's talk about slavery someplace else. Because this is the only place I've ever been, and this is the only place I've ever known the institution of slavery to exist in a way that I can identify with it as a human being or as an academic. And that includes Latin America too, even though I've never been there. I've been to Puerto Rico, but the same kind of thing, because the same kind of idea animated both. I don't want to end it on a downer note, but
Besides winning.
Do I have to stand up?
No, you don't.
Nothing about the role of black people was included in that. But are you seeing an increase in the awareness of the role of blacks in the American Revolution?
Well, I would say no, because the 1776 Project, I don't know if you know anything about that. I would just say read up on it. And I would say that what I have done tonight, probably if I did it in the classroom or if I was doing it here in drag or they knew I was doing it, the library might lose funding. Some people might say it's critical race theory. It's not critical race theory. It's the facts of this country, in that this country made particular legal and social and moral choices that created these fractures. I mean, there was a guy named Luther Martin. Look Luther Martin up. He was at the Constitutional Convention, and he was saying at the Constitutional Convention, hey guys, let's get rid of slavery. And people were like not having anything to do with Luther Martin. And so people, they may not want to talk about it. And when you talk about it, it's perceived as kind of like trying to kick American history, punch it in the face or something. I love doing history. I love the messiness of history. History to me is really messy. But what I get out of that is an appreciation for everybody's humanity. So that's the thing for me. That's how I enter it as an academic and as a person, so I don't have to be mad at people, because of what happened historically. But as a historian, I try to embody the minds. That doesn't make any sense, but I try to embody the minds of these people and kind of tell you what the world was like where they were, how they saw it, what choices they made. When Jefferson says we have the wolf by the ears, self-preservation is in one hand and justice is in the other. Yeah, people do things sometimes to save themselves at the expense of other people. We know this, right? And so why should we be surprised, or why should it be seen as demeaning to say that many of the founding fathers, they lived in a world where their wealth and property gave them the status to lead and be in important leadership positions, and to have emancipated people would have cost them that, so they chose not to emancipate people. It's a fact. They're dead, so there's nothing that can be done about it. You can't wind that clock back. So that's just kind of how I deal with it. It's like, that's what it was. As Michelle Obama once said, it is what it is, and that's just it. And that's how I deal with it. But I think knowing is important. Because knowing helps us get in conversations with people we don't know and understand their point of view. And I'm sorry, I'm going to work on trying to think about that Greek thing more.
Sort of help to wrap things up. What I used to say in my classroom, if I could share that, when we were doing American literature, is the fact that when slaves first came to America, some of our ancestors who were Scottish actually came to America as slaves. And Indians that were captured became slaves. And Africans that were imported became slaves. And it was usually on a temporary basis. They were slaves for 7 years, and then they were freed, whether they were Scottish, heaven forbid, or whether they were Native Americans, or whether they were black. But over a period that you mentioned, by the early 1700s, they realized that the Scots, even when they were slaves, could slip away and go to the next village and sort of blend in, and the Indians could sort of melt into the forest, or very often as slaves, the Native Americans died under slavery. It was just easier to catch people whose complexion was different. And so blacks were made slaves because, as you were saying, they were just easier to catch when they ran away and tried to be as free as the rest of us should automatically be. And so we institutionalized it as the country. We made the rules and made the laws. And a lot of us have ancestors who were actually American slaves, but they stopped being slaves. I would do my own little commentary and say, I think it's time all of us stop being slaves. That's what the country's about, right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, the discussions have begun here with Chautauqua, and we are exploring this year's secrets being revealed. And so there's lots of juicy stuff ahead. Over the next 3 months, we've got other library performances. So far, we've had Steve Jobs. We've had the world of the slave Lafayette, American Spy. We're going to have Nellie Bly, the famous reporter. We're going to have Mary Shelley, the writer of Frankenstein, the wife of one of the great romantic poets, Percy Shelley. And we're going to have Robert Ripley, the writer of Believe It or Not. We're going to have all those characters here. I do want to point out in the back of the room, there are a collection of books about the topics that we've talked about here tonight. And you are invited to check out a book and find out more about it. There's some wonderful books back there specializing in James, as well as other books about the topics. And I do want to thank our volunteers who have been here tonight helping to make sure everything is done. Thank you very much from the library for being here to help us put this show on tonight and share this information with the public. And thank you, the loyal fans of Chautauqua who have made it possible for us to be here with your own contributions to keep the program alive for now the 25th year. So thank you all very much. Be looking out for the next library program where I think, Laura, do you know right offhand who our next library program is? Is it Nellie Bly? It is Nellie Bly. And if you've not heard that story, you've got to check it out. And they've got flyers in the back with a listing of when and where everything is. Are we stacking chairs tonight? Yes. So if you don't mind, as you're leaving, if you could help us stack up the chairs, we'll just carry the chairs back to the back. You don't have to actually stack them there, and we'll get all these chairs put away. But if you can move them from the various places towards the back. Thank you all for coming. And for Dr. Harris, we appreciate you being here, all the information.